All right.
You're all set.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, good evening, everybody. So this is our third session of Who's Who and What's What in Jewish philosophy. Does everybody have a handout? Okay, great. So the title of this week's class, I think, would make the name of a good rock band. Moses Mendelssohn and the Porcelain Monkeys. Now, why the Porcelain Monkeys? Well, if you look at these pictures here, Mendelssohn is not the guy in the middle. That's the monkey in the middle. He is the person on the left. And you can see that they have this fashion for sort of, he has a beard, but it's a sort of, doesn't really have much of a mustache. It was sort of trimmed around the edges. Why the porcelain monkey? I think it's a good representation of the state of Jews in Berlin and Germany in general at the time, which is not the worst in Jewish history by any means, but nevertheless a certain humiliation. One of the rules of being a Jew in Berlin, in Prussia at the time, of course this is before the unification of Germany, so there are lots of little states and so on, is that if you wanted to get married, you had to buy porcelain monkeys from the king's porcelain factory. The king's porcelain factory was very bad. And as you can see, it's an extremely ugly monkey, but you had to buy a whole bunch of them. And these were kept in the family and passed down several generations after Moses Mendelssohn, certainly into the 20th century, as a reminder of what things had been like. Again, look, there are worse things in the world, but it was not easy. There was a certain, as I say, humiliation involved. No, Jews did not have civil rights. They had no right to live in Berlin. Some people had a special status, which Mendelssohn eventually attained, which was still not citizenship. Others could enter Berlin and stay there only on condition that they either support themselves or be supported by the Jewish community. And the way that it worked, therefore, was that there was a Jewish gatekeeper who would examine you and make sure that you were really able and willing to support yourself before he would let you in. Story about someone who I'm going to talk about next time, Salomon Maimon, is that the first time he tried to enter Berlin, he was refused entry because he answered rather too honestly. They said, "What do you want to do here?" And he said, I want to be, he said in Yiddish, to be mamik bechochma. I want to immerse myself in wisdom and write a commentary on Maimonides' guide. And the gatekeeper said, "We don't need you." And he eventually got in by hiding on the mail coach. Mendelssohn's a different story. He was born in Dessau in 1729, and his teacher was Rabbi David Frankel, who was the rabbi of Dessau at the time, was a great scholar. And when Rabbi Frankel was appointed the rabbi of Berlin, which was a very important position, Mendelssohn wanted to go with. He was just a young man, he was a teenager. So he went to Berlin to continue studying with his teacher, Rabbi Frankel, and he studied in Rabbi Frankel's yeshiva in Berlin. He eventually got a job there as a bookkeeper, eventually took over the company, and he settled there and married and had to buy the porcelain monkeys. Now, along the way, various interesting things happened. First thing to note, by way of background, goes back to last time. So last time I was saying that there's a unique thing about Judaism, the way it resolved the medieval controversy about philosophy, a controversy that affected Islam and Christianity as well. The way it worked out in Judaism was that Maimonides was both one of the most radical philosophers and at the same time an authoritative writer of the great legal code. So no matter what happened after the initial controversies, no matter how controversial Maimonides might be, the books were always there on the shelf for somebody who wanted to interest themselves in philosophy and educate themselves. Now, that meant that there were periodic revivals of Maimonideanism. Was not the case all the time, but if you wanted to revive it, it was possible. So it's noteworthy that in a town just near Dessau, and with the approval of the Dessau court, the rabbinical court, the first edition of Maimonides' guide, his philosophical work, to be printed for many, many centuries, was printed during Rabbi Frankel's rabbinate there. I don't think that's accidental. We don't know that much about Rabbi Frankel, but he seems to have been interested in Maimonides. The most famous work that he wrote, however, was a commentary on the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is still one of the two standard commentaries that everybody uses when they study that work. Mendelssohn himself was interested in Maimonides.
What language was it printed in?
It was printed in Hebrew. So it's a Hebrew translation of the Arabic original.
Okay.
Because not too many people around there knew the Arabic. But it's the translation that was done by Shmuel ibn Tibon in Provence in Maimonides' own lifetime, in correspondence with Maimonides. That's the standard Hebrew edition. Although now there are translations which are arguably better, but that was the standard one for a long time. Mendelssohn himself published a treatise, a sort of a translation of Maimonides' treatise on logical vocabulary, which is kind of an introduction to logic, and he wrote a commentary on that as well. So there was a revival of Maimonides in this particular circle, which was also very learned in traditional rabbinic texts. And in Berlin, Mendelssohn became friends with a group of non-Jews who were also philosophically interested. And this was really the thing that changed his life. And I'm sure that there were friendships before between Jews and non-Jews, but this was special in being a very public collaboration. They became a group that worked together. And in fact, Mendelssohn would probably not have dared to publish in German, which was not his native language. He spoke Yiddish originally, and he wrote in Hebrew. But he would probably not have dared if not for his friend Lessing. Lessing, who later was become one of the great playwrights, as well as philosophers and theologians of the German language. Lessing took something that Mendelssohn had written and was not sure whether he should publish it or not, and Lessing published it and presented it to Mendelssohn as a fait accompli and said, look, you're in print. And that broke through the barrier. And it was really, there are a whole bunch of people, but Lessing in particular and a man called Friedrich Nicolai, together with Mendelssohn, formed a group which became the core of the Berlin Enlightenment, Aufklärung in German. And they were committed to, first of all, the revival of German rationalist metaphysics. Now this was an age when everything French was fashionable. And at the Prussian court, one spoke only French. And things that were German were despised. And the great German philosophy of Leibniz in particular, and his follower Wolff, which had been very important, say 40 or 50 years earlier, had been pretty much forgotten. And instead people studied the French, and a lot of the French things that were popular, especially with the king, were materialist and rather reductionist accounts of human behavior and of the mind. And instead of this, Mendelssohn and his friends thought that actually Leibniz was a great metaphysician who was preferable in many ways to the French materialists and could really give an account of the mind and of religion that was worth having. So they tried to revive that. At the same time, they also thought that the rationalist tradition of Leibniz had been overly intellectualist. That is to say, it had not paid sufficient attention to the senses, and in particular to the enjoyment of things that one perceives with one's senses. So this is the generation that first used the word aesthetics. It was invented as a German word, and they felt they could give an account of what is beautiful and what is enjoyable without giving up Leibniz's rationalist philosophy. So this was their goal, and the three of them, along with some other people, wrote literary criticism as well as sort of metaphysical treatises on the basis of aesthetics. So they talked about, in some detail, about what was good and what was bad about certain poems in particular, or about music, and they tried to show that you could enjoy these things and explain your enjoyment of them in a way that still allowed for the supremacy of reason, whereas before people had said, oh yes, the rationalist philosophers, they only care about reason, they don't care about the aesthetic at all. So they wanted to show that you could really have both, and they had a very sophisticated, especially Mendelssohn, had a very sophisticated way of doing this, into the details of which I will not go now. But if it was, if it was a course on Mendelssohn, then that's what we'd probably do. Now, I think he really hit the height of fame when he won first prize. Of course, he couldn't really be awarded it because he was a Jew, but he nevertheless won in the Berlin Academy of Sciences. The Berlin Academy had been founded by Leibniz, who was long since dead, and then taken over by these people who preferred the French things. And this was already beginning to be controversial. So they set up an essay competition on the question of what sort of evidence do you have in metaphysics? Is metaphysics as rigorous as mathematics or not? So those who favored the French view would have said, no, it's nothing like mathematics, it can never be a science. And those who favored the German view would favor the view that metaphysics is pretty rigorous and as much as mathematics. So Mendelssohn argued that to a certain extent, when it comes to proving the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, metaphysics is just as rigorous as mathematics.
Is that what metaphysics is proving the existence of God?
Well, that's one of the big questions. There are three big questions of metaphysics as understood in this period, which is the existence and nature of God, so that's rational theology, the existence and nature of the soul, which is rational psychology, and the existence and nature of the world, its structure, which is cosmology. So Immanuel Kant also entered this competition and came second. But Mendelssohn and Kant actually became pretty good friends, and Mendelssohn visited Kant in Königsberg, a famous event. It was because the Jewish community was having difficulty with the local censors who wanted to change the religious service, and they called Mendelssohn, who was by now very famous, in to help them. And this became an important part of Mendelssohn's life. Once he did become famous, he was often called upon to intercede on behalf of the Jewish community with the government. He was a Stadtler, as they say. And on that occasion, he also went to visit Kant, who taught at the University of Königsberg. And the story goes that when Mendelssohn entered the lecture hall, the students started yelling anti-Semitic insults at this, what's this old Jew doing here? And Kant was very upset by this, so he went to the top of the stairs and showed Mendelssohn respect, and he took him by the arm and led him to a place of honor, and everyone shut up. So, this was in the 1760s then, when Mendelssohn really became famous. He also published a work called the Phaedo, which is the same name as a dialogue of Plato's, about the immortality of the soul, and I'll say in a minute why that's important. And he became known as the German Socrates. And, amazingly, he was particularly famous for his lucid and elegant German style. And as I said, he was not a native German speaker, let's say High German. He was a native Yiddish speaker. So it was, this happens. Sometimes non-native speakers can become excellent writers in a language, but it's rare. At the same time, I think it should be said that he was always the person who was regarded as the exception, right? From the non-Jewish point of view, it was amazing wonder that there could be a Jew like this, but that did not tell us that there could be other Jews like that. The beginning of a major change in Mendelssohn's life came at the end of this decade in 1769. He had met a man called Lavater, who was from Switzerland, he's most famous probably for developing the science of physiognomy, which is determining the character of a person by the features of the face, and he was really famous for that. But he was also something of an enthusiast for a certain kind of Christianity. And he and Mendelssohn must have had some informal conversation at some coffee house or party or something like that, where Mendelssohn said, there's something to the effect of lots of things about Jesus which I can appreciate, or Something like that. Lavater then wrote an open letter to Mendelssohn saying, because of what you said to me about how much you appreciate Jesus, I now call upon you in front of the entire world either to convert to Christianity, because the proofs, and he was pointing to a particular book by a man called Charles Bonnet, the proof of Christianity is very clear, or else to explain what is wrong with Christianity. Well, that put the man with the porcelain monkey in a very difficult position. We know from the Middle Ages and the experience of Nachmanides that you do not, if you're a Jew, actually win a religious disputation. If you win, you lose. And if you lose, you lose. It's not good. Mendelssohn did not want to be in that position, but he would now be stuck there basically for the rest of his life. Now, it should be said that because of the kind of people with whom Mendelssohn associated, they were also really, really upset with Lavater. They felt that he had breached a sort of almost an unspoken rule of the friendship between these non-Jews and Jews by calling Mendelssohn out in this way. They were not happy with him, but it happened. And Mendelssohn had to reply, and he did. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. The medical details are very unclear at this point. However, maybe as a result of this, and maybe it was independent, Mendelssohn became ill around this time. It's hard to say what it was, but his doctors advised him not to do philosophy anymore. It was too strenuous for him. He had some kind of breakdown. I don't know what it was. But he could not do the same kind of strenuous intellectual work, continued to work as a bookkeeper. And he still wanted to do things in the world. So around this time, his children were young, and he had hired a tutor called Shlomo Dubno to teach his children. And his children, growing up in Berlin, very unusual for Jews at the time, were speaking High German. They were not speaking Yiddish as he had learned. And Mendelssohn and Dubno thought, there really should be a good translation of the Chumash, of the Pentateuch, into German for Jews. And the only ones around were either bad or else were very Christian. So they started to translate the Bible, at first for Mendelssohn's children. And Mendelssohn found that this was something that he could do even when he wasn't feeling well. And he came up with the idea in the 70s, together with Dubno and a few other Jews in Berlin, who had strong rabbinic backgrounds but were very much part of the Enlightenment, of translating the entire Hebrew Bible, at least the Pentateuch at first. And Mendelssohn divided up the job amongst them. He also wrote a commentary to the entire Pentateuch. Sometimes some of it was just him, some of it was collaborative, some of it was the other people. This translation became extremely controversial among Jews. I'll explain why later on. At the same time, he also continued to be forced to reply to Lavater and other such people. He wasn't the only one challenging Mendelssohn's Judaism, and he tried to explain his commitment to Judaism without compromising the Jewish community and putting them in any kind of danger. He published a book in 1783, which is probably his philosophical masterpiece, called Jerusalem, which is one of the most important arguments in the modern age for the separation of church and state. And it's implicitly and explicitly, I suppose, to some extent, an argument for Jews to be given civil rights on the basis of such a separation. At the same time, it has implications for Judaism too, because Mendelssohn's argument is that religious institutions should not use coercive power. Now, the Jewish community had always had coercive power. It had a court system of its own, and court decisions were enforced. And there were punishments if you didn't do what the court said. That's how it worked. It was a legal system. So Mendelssohn basically said, look, I think we should give up the enforcement of Jewish court decisions. But by the same token, we're not just going to give that up alone. All religious institutions, the Christian ones too, should give this up. And then everybody should be equal to become citizens. Only the state, which should be neutral between religions, at least with respect to citizenship, should exercise coercive power. So that was a very important argument to be made. Finally, a major controversy broke out towards the end of Mendelssohn's life about his best friend, Lessing. And I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, let me move on to number 2, the spectre of Spinoza. Now, at the time when Mendelssohn came along, the scientific revolution was already pretty well established. Really already in the 17th and early 18th century, and now we're at the end of the 18th century. The only Jew who had really played a central role in that development was Baruch Spinoza. There were other Jews who played various roles, but the only one who was a really major thinker of the scientific revolution was Spinoza. So he was a precedent for Mendelssohn in the sense that he was a pioneer. At the same time, Spinoza was notorious. His was the most notorious name in Europe. If you wanted to destroy someone's career and reputation, you would call them a Spinozist. And that lasted all the way through the 19th century. Right? Spinoza had written books which were considered by the church to be, quote, written in hell, unquote. Right? I mean, and of course he had been thrown out of the Jewish community as well, and died a peaceful death, but was much hated by people. So this was a problem as well for Mendelssohn. You know, there was a precedent, but a problem. What do you do with Spinoza? How could you not say something about him? In his early writings, Mendelssohn portrays Spinoza as a tragic, heroic figure who almost had the right idea about things, but didn't quite, because he was not quite Leibniz. Now, Spinoza, by the way, was older than Leibniz, and they met. And Leibniz was very much influenced by Spinoza's ideas. However, Leibniz thought that he could develop some of those ideas without any of the consequences that were considered so horrific. And I don't want to go into details about Spinoza's system, but basically, look, Spinoza thinks that not only is the material world a mechanism that develops and unfolds in a determined way according to laws. That was a fairly standard view in the scientific revolution. But the mind is also a sort of mechanism. That was not the standard view, right? Descartes and other people want to say, okay, the material world, that's mechanical, but the mind is something else. Spinoza said, no, they're both basically mechanisms. They're completely different. Each has its own laws. The material world has its laws and the mind has its laws. However, each one is a reflection of God. Each one is an aspect of God. God is immanent in everything. And everything is a reflection of God. Now, according to that view, though, God is itself not a personality in any sense, has no free will. God is simply the fundamental basis of reality. And God operates according to necessity.
And he's subject to laws?
Yes. Well, he's the basis of laws. It's hard to say exactly.
No, but it, by implication.
Yes. Everything is necessary, and that's certainly God as well. There's no such thing as freedom of the will. So that meant that God did not create the world because the world just is a reflection of God. And secondly, God couldn't have chosen to create the world because God doesn't choose. At the same time, when you look at human beings, we don't have freedom of the will either. So a lot of people felt that ethical responsibility would be thrown away if you accepted this view. And one of the biggest puzzles for people in the 18th century and the 17th century is how come Spinoza, who had such horrible views, contrary to the foundations of religion and society, how could he have been such a tzaddik? How was he such a perfect person? Because nobody ever said a bad word about his behavior. And this is a big mystery to everyone. He was basically a saint. Right. So Mendelssohn's story is that Spinoza really had some crucial metaphysical ideas. However, they were not quite developed. And had he developed them a little bit further, the way Leibniz did, first of all, he could have reconciled all of his views with religion. And secondly, they would not have had the horrific consequences that everybody accused him of. I think it's also not accidental, as I mentioned, that Mendelssohn's Phaedo argues for the immortality of the soul, just like Plato's dialogue about the same topic. The one big thing that Spinoza seems to have really got into trouble for was rejecting the immortality of the soul. Again, this came up last time as well. Remember that for Maimonides, the soul was not by its nature immortal. And some people objected to that, although philosophers could acquire immortality by philosophizing. For Spinoza, there's no such thing as immortality. The soul or the mind is the idea of a body. And yes, that idea will continue in God's mind after the body goes, but that doesn't mean that you're alive or anything like that. It's just the idea. So I don't think it's accidental that Mendelssohn also argued for the immortality of the soul. He was trying to show that he really could avoid Spinoza's heresies. Although what happened partly as a result of his obsession with Spinoza was that Lessing and other people in Mendelssohn's circle became very interested in Spinoza, and there was a subterranean interest in the study of Spinoza among a number of German intellectuals. And that will come back at the end of Mendelssohn's life. Okay, so I'll move on to number 3, Mendelssohn's mitigated rationalism. Now, to say that Leibniz or Spinoza was a rationalist is to say that they thought by pure reason alone you could prove, this is what I mentioned before about the 3 areas of metaphysics. First of all, the existence and nature of God. Second, the existence and nature of the soul. Again, they might disagree about its immortality, but at least they felt they could prove what they believed rationally with the rigor of mathematics. And thirdly, they could prove what the structure of the world really was. And that's the area known as cosmology. Mendelssohn's rationalism is mitigated because he really thinks that there are limited things that we can prove. What we can prove, we really can prove. But we can only prove that God exists and certain things about God. We can prove the immortality of the soul and certain things about the soul. We really can't prove very much at all, Mendelssohn thinks, about the nature of the world. That he thinks you just have to do experiments and try and figure it out on the basis of empirical science to the extent that you can. Not that the other people were against that, but they felt that they were both avenues of investigation. Mendelssohn's proofs of God and of the soul are extremely elegant. Kant and other people said he's the greatest when it comes to giving these really great proofs in metaphysics. He's the best. But at the same time, it's a very important part of Mendelssohn's view that reason only goes so far. Now, what happens when you can't prove something rationally? Then you appeal to what Mendelssohn called common sense. This was quite a fashionable term at the time, coming both from the French tradition, bon sens, but also from the Scottish common sense philosophers as well. Mendelssohn felt that if a person was brought up well in a good culture and community, they would be able to intuitively understand certain things that maybe we couldn't prove. Maybe eventually we'll prove them, but we couldn't do it now. Maybe we'll never prove them. In any event, he was very comfortable relying on common sense of that kind. So, for example, that the world is governed by divine providence. This is one of his examples. He says, I can't prove that. I don't think we ever will, but I feel it, and I'm okay with that. And the fact that I can't prove it rationally does not give me any reason for doubt.
So is that faith?
Yes. But it's important to say that faith for him just means something like undeveloped reason. It's not something other than reason. He thinks that the mind has an intuitive grasp of things that are rational, like divine providence. And it would be nice if you could prove it, but you don't have to. But it's not as though you've got some other capacity for knowledge based on something other than reason. He also felt that Judaism was the most compatible of all of the monotheistic faiths, he doesn't talk about Islam, but at least compared to Christianity, with the deliverances of common sense and reason. Of course, this was a controversial position, and he probably would never have said it if Lavater hadn't challenged him. So what does he mean by that? Like other Enlightenment figures, he thought there was such a thing as natural religion. That is to say, a rational person, independently of their culture, independently of their religious tradition, if they really thought things out, would come to certain conclusions. There is a God, there's only one God, and so on. There's reward and punishment, right? This sort of things. And everybody should agree on those things, Mendelssohn thought. Now, Christianity, in addition to those beliefs, has dogmas. That is to say, beliefs that it requires you to have on the basis of faith, such as belief in the Trinity, the Trinitarian nature of God, belief in the incarnation, belief in the resurrection, and so on. And these dogmas not only cannot be proven, but they at least appear to conflict with something rational. Mendelssohn felt that in Judaism there are no dogmas. There are natural and rational beliefs, and there is a historical tradition that goes back to Mount Sinai. So there's a kind of historical or traditional belief. But traditional belief is not the same thing as a dogma. And most of all, Mendelssohn said, there is the tradition of mitzvot and halakha, and there are practices, there are laws, there are commandments, and that's fundamentally what Judaism is about. It's not a system of dogma. So it's very different from Christianity. And for that reason, he said, it really does not conflict with common sense and reason in the same way that Christianity does. So his non-Jewish friends were trying to reconcile their religions with reason, and they had to reinterpret various dogmas. Mendelssohn felt, I don't have to do that. I'm free of that worry. Yes?
Is the rite of circumcision a dogma?
No, because it's not a belief. It's a practice. So Mendelssohn thinks that Jewish practices, which were commanded either as part of the written law or part of the oral law, are meant to symbolize either certain aspects of rational, natural religion, right? So, for example, when we keep Shabbat, we're symbolically enacting our belief in the existence of God, something which is rationally based, or they are symbolic representations of our history. So circumcision, for example, is a symbolic enactment of the covenantal relationship between the people of Israel and God. Right? So that's really, and Mendelssohn has an account of Judaism along those lines. So he says, this is 3a from the book Jerusalem, Judaism knows of no revealed religion in the sense in which Christians understand the term. Right? Religion for them is dogma. The Israelites possess a divine legislation, laws, commandments, ordinances, rules of life, instruction in the will of God as to how they should conduct themselves in order to attain temporal and eternal felicity. Propositions and prescriptions of this kind were revealed to them by Moses in a miraculous and supernatural manner, but no doctrinal opinions, no saving truths, no universal propositions of reason. These, that is to say, propositions of reason, the Eternal reveals to us and to all other men at all times through nature and thing, but never through word and script. Mendelssohn also argues for the important mission of Judaism in the world. And for him, the basis of that has to do with Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law. So he argues, and here he's drawing on some theories that were around about the origin of writing and its role in Egyptian religion and so on. He argues that in civilizations where symbols and writing are crucial, as in ours, there will be a tendency towards a kind of idolatry. The symbol will tend to take the place of the thing it symbolizes. And there are great dangers in this when it comes to religious belief. Judaism kept the Torah largely oral in order to avoid this. And in fact, as Maimonides thought, much of our actual practices are meant to counteract the tendency of human beings towards idolatry. So he felt that in general the law is designed against idolatry, to uproot it from our minds and from civilization, and the oral character of the Torah, in particular, is a kind of cultural protest within civilization, within the world, against the dominance of the symbol, which could lead to idolatry. So Jews play a very important part in the world. Maybe I'll just read the very last thing on page 2 from the last thing he wrote, actually, to the Friends of Lessing in 1785. Judaism consists exclusively of revealed laws of worship, again, not dogmas. Some people, by the way, interpret this to mean that Judaism has no beliefs and that it's only practice. That is not what Mendelssohn means. It does have beliefs. First of all, the beliefs required by reason. And secondly, the beliefs that are part of our history and tradition. The belief that God took us out of Egypt and so on. But those are not dogmas in the sense of Christian dogma. And presumes a natural and reasonable conviction as to religious truths, without which no divine law can be established. But when I speak of reasonable conviction and insist on making it an incontestable premise within Judaism, I'm not speaking of the metaphysical argumentation we usually carry out in books, nor am I speaking of scholastic demonstrations that withstand every test to which the subtlest of doubts may subject them. But I speak of the statements and judgments of a simple, sound human understanding, which looks things directly in the eye and reflects upon them calmly. That's what he calls common sense. Doubts can be raised against my arguments, errors of inference pointed out, yet will my conviction remain unshakable. In the end, Judaism just is a systematic way of life that embodies common sense. And the whole education that we get as Jews is meant to ensure that we retain our common sense. Unlike attempts at rational proof, common sense is unshakable. You can always make a mistake in a mathematical argument, and someone can point it out later on. But common sense is not based on proof, and therefore is not subject to the same sort of error. That's his view.
And what was the Christian rationalist response to this perspective?
To completely misunderstand it. And in fact, it was, as a PR exercise, I'm sorry to say, it was a disaster. A certain Christian tradition, especially in the Lutheran tradition that was dominant in much of Germany, in northern Germany where he was, despises the notion of law and emphasizes the spirit of things rather than the letter of the law. So when Mendelssohn said, I don't have religion, I have law, this was heard as if it confirmed the worst suspicions that everybody had about Judaism, that it was simply legalism and that it had no spiritual dimension whatsoever. So, brilliant as the argument may have seemed, from a public relations point of view, it failed totally. And it's an amazing thing. I mean, people will repeat these arguments, Kant included, and as if he's just made the confession of that the most negative things that people wanted to say about Judaism are true. It's just law, and who could be excited about the law that tells you to put your seatbelt on or something like that, right? That's the way they understood it. They did not understand. He did not succeed in conveying the spiritual height of of what we call mitzvot, of commandments, divine commandments. That would, I'd like to say, be done by later generations, but at least in Mendelssohn's generation, that did not happen. Now, I mentioned before the translation project, that this became one of the big controversies among the Jews about Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn in his lifetime was largely admired by Jews. They were very proud of him. As I said, he was known as the German Socrates, and no Jew had ever had such a prominent role in intellectual and cultural life. They had been successful economically and to some extent politically as advisors and so on, but not as thinkers. That was something else. But Mendelssohn's translation project really caused some ripples. What was the justification? So, if you look at Roman numeral number 4:1, in the prospectus that Mendelssohn and Dubno put out, and probably Dubno wrote the text, they explained that there's no decent Jewish German translation. There is one, but it's bad translation. And he says, look, our children are now talking German, and they would benefit from a Jewish translation. It's important to realize that the number of children that they were talking about was tiny. And it may be true that at least some of the Jewish children in Berlin were learning German, maybe in Hamburg and a couple of other places, but that was about it. The rest of Germany, never mind further east, Jews were speaking Yiddish. There was still such a thing as Western Yiddish. My grandmother, who grew up in Germany, I once said to her that her grandparents must have spoken Western Yiddish, and she practically threw me out the house. She was very proud of the German heritage, but I'm sure that it was true. They did speak Western Yiddish, and she still knew a few words of it too. But there was another motivation as well. If you look at a letter that Mendelssohn wrote to a non-Jewish friend, he puts it rather differently. This is 1b. He's explaining that he became ill and he couldn't work in philosophy. He says, I lost the ability to meditate, and as a result, initially, the major portion of my happiness. After some examination, I found a useful service to my children, and perhaps to a considerable part of my nation, by giving into their hands a better translation and explanation of the Holy Scriptures than they had before. This is the first step towards culture, from which, alas, my nation is kept at such a distance that one might almost despair of the possibility of an improvement. However, I considered myself obliged to do the little that lies in my power, and to leave the rest to Providence, which, as a rule, requires more time for the execution of its plan than we can ever see at a glance. So Mendelssohn's secret motivation was to introduce the Jews to a higher level of culture. And this is exactly what his Jewish opponents feared. It's not the official explanation that he gave. And Mendelssohn and his friends felt that because of Christian persecution, Jews had lost a certain amount of their own cultivation and ability to be cultured people. So there was something negative about Jewish life. Christians largely agreed with that, but they didn't blame Christian persecution for it. They thought that was the Jews' fault. Some Christians agreed, however, and they were good friends of Mendelssohn. So, on the other side, a lot of Jewish leaders would not have wanted to admit there was anything negative about Jewish life, and did not want Jews to be introduced to German culture. We were perfectly fine as we were. And of course they were also worried that if you did introduce Jews to German culture, the next step after a certain acculturation would be assimilation and conversion. And this is really the argument about the translation.
How does the translation introduce them to German culture?
Because it introduces them to the German language, and if they can read that, then they can presumably read other things in German too. Now, I don't have a copy with me to show you, but actually it's written in Hebrew letters, you know, like Yiddish is, but it's High German. And you might think, well, it's not that different. Later editions used German letters, but at this time they were Hebrew letters. But there's no question that Mendelssohn did in fact have that in mind, and that's what they were afraid of. The politics of language varied greatly depending on where you were and what the nature of the Jewish community was. In Berlin, Mendelssohn had the approval of his friend, the rabbi, not David Frenkel, but his successor, Rabbi Herschel Levin, who had been a student in yeshiva with Mendelssohn, and so on. He wrote a very enthusiastic approval of this project, said, our children really need this. Take the same book a little further east. Take it to Prague. Right? Now, Prague is in what was largely German-speaking area, although of course there are other languages there as well, but it was dominated at the time by the Habsburgs and so on. It's an area known to Jews as Mähren. Jews are speaking Yiddish there. There are very few Jews speaking High German. There it suddenly became very controversial. Why should Jews start to speak German? Why do I use this translation and you're teaching our children German? You're not teaching them Chumash anymore. So this became a massive fight, basically. In the first place in Prague. The other issue, once you move further east into the Austrian Empire, is that the Emperor Joseph had issued in 1782, which is the time when Mendelssohn is publishing this so-called Letter of Tolerance. which says, you Jews can become citizens, but I'm going to ask of you something in return. You have to learn German. You have to change your education system. You've got to become part of this society fully. And everyone suspected, and frankly, they had some reason to suspect, this was really an attempt to get the Jews to convert. So further east, when Mendelssohn's translation came along, it was perceived as collaborating with a government attempt to impose German culture on the Jews. To make it worse, one of Mendelssohn's collaborators in the project, a man called Herz Homburg, after Mendelssohn's death, was hired by the Austrian government to carry out this task. Right? And the Jews hated him. I mean, they absolutely hated him. In Galicia, in the part of Poland that was annexed by Austria, you could not get married unless you went to Hamburg and you were examined by him on the book about marriage, Jewish marriage, that he wrote in High German. And he was in charge, and he was going around telling all the Hasidim, because that was also going on at the time, you can't teach your children this way, you've got to change the way you dress. They absolutely hated him, they thought he was the devil, and they associated him with Mendelssohn, even though that had nothing to do with Mendelssohn personally. And this has led to a very strange feature of Mendelssohn's reputation, which is that in Eastern Europe, away from Germany where Mendelssohn was active, Mendelssohn has a reputation that I think bears very little relation to who he actually was in his lifetime. In particular, Orthodox Jews in Eastern Europe, or Orthodox Jews from Eastern European tradition, think of Mendelssohn as a heretic, as all kinds of horrible things. And the truth is that nobody would have said that about him in his lifetime who knew of him at all. He was a traditional Jew. It's true that he wanted to introduce Jews to German culture. He had no destructive intentions with respect to Judaism at all. And I was surprised to learn this myself in the more sort of German Jewish background where I grew up, also Lithuanian, but in the German Jewish background, even among Orthodox Jews, Mendelssohn was always respected. There was no question about that. And once I had to stay for Shabbos once with a Hasidic Rebbe in Milwaukee, member of the Twersky family, and he asked me what sort of things do you do when you work on Jewish philosophy. So I said, well, for example, Mendelssohn. And the faces around the table, look, I thought, I didn't know anything was wrong with that. Apparently it was one of the worst names I could have possibly
And what were they
mentioned.
doing in Germany?
Who?
These people who didn't want to move an inch to...
They were east.
Oh, they were further east for the most part. What
were they doing there if they didn't want to acquire something about the local environment?
Well, they were quite happy with their own Jewish way of
Why
life.
were they... Maybe the historical reasons which I'm totally missing, but why didn't they go to back to Palestine?
Well, they may have wanted to do that. It was not such an easy journey to make at the time, and there were some Jews living there, but not very many. It was not an easy trip to make.
Well, it was almost happenstance in a way that's why they hate Mendelssohn, because it could have been whoever
Yes.
was translating.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything of Mendelssohn's views in there.
No. And in fact, there's this funny game that people still play, which goes like this. We know that Mendelssohn was a heretic, but we don't know why. Can we find something in his writings that shows why we hate him?
Well, if they were in Eastern Europe, they didn't know German to begin with. So
Right.
they couldn't have read his books
No.
to know what he really said.
Right.
It's like somebody hating, these movies that come out of Christianity and the church, who won't see it, condemns it.
Yes.
When they haven't even seen it.
Yeah. In the 80s, there was first of all, the great biography of Mendelssohn by Alexander Altmann came out. It's a wonderful book. And it's Altmann's, he was the last Orthodox rabbi in Berlin. It's his great testament to German Jewry that was. The book was read by Avi Shafran, who is sort of a journalist and rabbi and a representative of Agudas Yisrael, the Orthodox organization. And Shafran was impressed by the book, and he thought, well, Mendelssohn, I didn't know Mendelssohn was so religious and so observant. And he wrote an article in the Aguda magazine saying, wow, who knew that Mendelssohn was so frum? So, what was wrong with him? And then he says, it must be that he did not sufficiently respect the great rabbis of his time. And you can find a couple of articles. I don't think it's any different from what you find most people say, to be honest, but there are a couple of letters, like this letter to Hennings and so on, but other such letters where Mendelssohn does criticize, shall we say, the religious leadership of his day and say, what does this rabbi from some little village really know, and so on. So he says maybe that's why we, but otherwise Mendelssohn was, he says, how is Mendelssohn's translation different from what Art Scroll does today? Shafran said.
So Paul, the Misnachim of and the Hasidic
Yes.
rivalry, did Misnachim embrace Mendelssohn?
Not exactly. Let me come to that in a second.
Okay, I'm sorry. Because you said you're tradition.
Yes. I'll talk about that in a second.
Sorry.
The end of the Shafran story is this. The next month, he had to retract that article. And the head of the Rabbinic Council, the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah of Agudas Yisrael, wrote a letter saying, we know that Mendelssohn was a heretic, and anybody who says any different is wrong. And Shafran had to retract it. Okay, very interesting question. Misnagdim and Hasidim. In Lithuania, here's what happened. First of all, Dubno himself, who had been the tutor in Mendelssohn's home to Mendelssohn's children, left and went to Lithuania. He went to Vilna. And he was highly respected there, but he separated himself from the other members of the group, especially the ones who went to Austria and tried to help the government impose changes in Jewish education. An edition of Mendelssohn's and Dubno's commentary was published without the translation. Just the commentary, which, by the way, is very traditional. I mean, it's more of it's not Art Scroll, but it's a digest of some of the traditional commentaries with some original remarks. This was widely used in Lithuania, and in the main yeshivas, it was a principal subject of study. It's known as the Biur, the commentary on the Chumash. So in the great yeshiva of Volozhin, this was the way Chumash was studied, with Mendelssohn's commentary, but in Hebrew and without the translation. In Hasidic areas, that did not happen, and Mendelssohn and his whole group were really reviled and hated, and the book was actually burnt. So there's a difference. What happened there? Difference.
Right.
Ultimately, there's been an influence, I think, of the Hasidic attitude on the Lithuanian attitude. So now, if you would mention in yeshiva that Mendelssohn's Biur was used in the yeshiva of Volozhin, people would be absolutely horrified. It could never have happened, even though I can show that it did. Yeah, and occasionally people found it was the same thing in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. There was a yeshiva founded called Eitz Chaim, which is the name of the yeshiva of Volozhin, and not too many decades ago, people found copies of Mendelssohn's Biur in the library, and they felt they needed to burn them. That's because they were part of the syllabus originally in the 19th and early 20th century. So things have changed in that respect. In Prague, which is the center of the early controversy in Mendelssohn's lifetime, the chief rabbi of Prague was Rabbi Yechezkel Landau. He's known, as many Jews are, by the title of their most famous book. He's known as the Noda B'Yehuda. And he was caught in a rather difficult position. He had people to the right saying you got to ban the book altogether. He was not so against it, so he had a compromise. And he said, look, we're not going to ban the book. We're not going to say anything negative about Mendelssohn. He's a good guy. However, the translation, I see the problem. Maybe we shouldn't be teaching our children High German. So I'm going to sponsor another translation, which will be better than the existing ones, but it won't have the same problems as Mendelssohn's. It'll be in Yiddish, but it'll be a better translation. And that's what he did. And it was something of a compromise. But there were other people who were pushing him to ban the book, and it's important that he never did. the picture at the end here on page 4 is from a eulogy that was published on the occasion of the death of the Rabbi of Prague, Rabbi Cheskel Landau. And the author felt that in the afterlife, Rabbi Landau and Mendelssohn would be friends. And he shows Landau, who was a lot taller than Mendelssohn, rushing to embrace Mendelssohn, who had already died earlier. And they're reconciled after death, as it were. But they were not thought of as enemies. But as I say, the further east you go, the more virulent the opposition becomes. But the final thing that happened in Mendelssohn's life that arguably killed him, certainly what his friends said, was this. I'm going to have to stop, so I don't want to take up your time too much. But is it okay if I just say a little bit about it? All right, so his friend Lessing, his non-Jewish friend Lessing, died in 1781. Mendelssohn wanted to write a memorial volume about Lessing. A man called Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi got involved, and he let it be known. He said, I have some information about Lessing that you probably should know. So I went to see Lessing before he died, and he told me he was a Spinozist. Mendelssohn was not happy about this. Right? You know, it's like saying he was a secret communist in the 50s or something, right? It was not good. It was going to ruin his reputation. And Jacobi was very deliberate about all this. There was no way to check whether Lessing had said these things or not. Jacobi and Mendelssohn get into correspondence. It doesn't go very well, and eventually each of them publishes a book. And they get into a big argument, and Mendelssohn supposedly died because he was so anxious to reply to Jacobi that he ran out into the night without a coat. He wanted to mail the manuscript. It was a book called To Lessing's Friends, and he waited for Shabbos to be over, and it was late at night, and he ran out. He wanted to get somewhere to deliver this manuscript, and he caught a cold and he died. So the friend said Jacobi killed him. But Mendelssohn insisted, and he really returned to some of the subjects of his earlier work, that look, even if Lessing had said he was a Spinozist, it still wouldn't be the end of the world, because, you know, Spinozism is not all bad, and a little tweak here and there, and you could even make it consistent with religion, Judaism or Christianity, depending on your predilections. And that was the way in which he defended him. And he published a book called Morning Hours, Morgenstunden, which is a really quite remarkable work for someone who was ill. And it's because he found in the last decade of his life, he could, for a few hours early in the morning, he could do philosophy. So after Shacharis, after the morning service, he and his son and a few other people would get together and they would do philosophy, and Mendelssohn would give a lecture, and he wrote that up. And that has some of his best metaphysical work. But that controversy, for reasons that maybe I'll say something about next time, actually changed the nature of the whole debate about religion in Germany for the next century, for the 19th century. Thanks.
Did you know that Moses Mendelssohn is it today's times?
No, I didn't see that.
Very interesting article. They were going to name the street in front of the Holocaust Museum after Moses Mendelssohn. But the German city council has a new rule that all city streets now have to be named after females with equal number of males.
Okay.
So they could call it Mrs. Mendelssohn.
Yeah.
Yes.
He was key in supporting him.
Yes.
That's today's wicked.
Yes. Right. So they could call it Frommet Mendelssohn Strasse. And I didn't give you the picture. There's a wonderful picture, which is it's a fantasy, but a great German Jewish painter in the 19th century imagined the scene. So he has Mendelssohn and Lessing playing chess. Lavater is standing there, and Mrs. Mendelssohn is bringing in the tea.
So she should.
Yes.
At the least.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.